All right, we get to move on to actually constructing things now. For this part of the lesson, I'm actually going to do a couple of things differently. We are going to cut our squares in half, and actually for this you can just have me do this and you can use your normal squares. I'm using fabric that has a right side and a wrong side just for demonstration purposes. The right side of the fabric is the side that's intended to be shown when the garment or project is finished, and then the side with less color or pattern is called the wrong side. So go ahead and get some fabric squares together that have a right and wrong side if you like, and then cut them in half. So I have a 2" by 4" so that they'll fit in your book better. For our first seam, it's just going to be a standard seam. We're going to place the fabric with the right sides together, and we're going to sew a 5/8 inch seam using a 2.5 stitch length right there, and of course using a straight stitch. So I'm going to just sew this guy in, use a back stitch, and then chug along. Whoa. And then we are going to press that open. You just press that open with an iron and paste it in your book. That is your very first seam. You'll see here that the edges are raw, and we're going to go on to talk about some ways to finish those raw edges. But this is your first seam, and you can see that 2.5 stitch length is enough to keep the thread from being visible and holding the fabric together securely. Okay, this seam is going to start just like a basic simple seam like we just made, just a 2.5 stitch down the middle, and then press the seam allowance to one side so that it looks nice and tidy there. Of course, this time I have loaded my machine with pink thread, coordinating because we're going to do a top stitch. I'm going to do a top stitch, so I'll bump my stitch length up to about 3.5. Let's do 3.5 because it's not a construction stitch. I'll come in here. Now I've got my needle centered this time, and so a good way to get a nice even top stitch, because this is going to matter, it's going to show, I'm going to line this seam up with the far left part of the window of this J-foot. Let me get it in there. And so my needle's centered. I may even move it over just a little bit to get it tighter. But as long as I keep this seam running right along this little guide, then I'm going to have a straight stitch. You can go kind of slow with this if you want, just to make sure it's nice and even. Now a top stitch is pretty and decorative, but it's also functional. Let's get it out here so you can see it. I think that after I top stitch, I like to still give it a little, let me wade you out there. I still like to press it one more time just to get any puckering out of the way. So it's pretty, a top stitch is pretty, but also it's kind of a great way to keep seams ironed and in place so that when you wash it and it comes back out, you're not going to have to find that seam again. It's got your original construction seam held in place. And so on this side, you can see that the seam allowance has been officially tacked to one side. So this seam will not close, and it will stay right as it is. So I hope that makes sense. That is a top stitch. Okay, so the first two stitches that we learned today are the simple stitch, where it is just one stitch pressed to the side with these raw edges here. And then the second stitch we learned was a simple stitch plus a top stitch with the coordinating thread, and we still have raw edges on the back. And so the next stitch that I want to teach you is a French seam, so that it looks like a simple stitch plus a top stitch, but there are no raw edges here. So this is going to be kind of your fancy stitch to learn today. And we don't begin with our right sides together like we do with most of our other stitches, and that throws me off every time. We're going to start with our wrong sides together and do a quick edge stitch. I'm going to do a 2.5 length and just run my stitch down. Now I'm going to trim my seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to cut off about half of that. And I'm going to press it open. So now that I've got it pressed flat, I'm going to turn it all the way to be pressed open so that now the seam is pulled all the way to the edge and the right sides are together. You can probably see what's happening here. We're enclosing this seam. So we're going to run that stitch again, this time with the right sides together. And then our seam that we just created is on the far right side here. Let's give that a quick spray. Press that open. And now we're going to do our top stitch because we know how to do that. So make sure you know which side your seam is folded to. And it's nice to look now. Your seam is all concealed and hidden. You've got it trimmed to the right length inside there so it's not going to come through. We'll do our top stitch. A nice straight stitch because this one's going to show. And I like to press my top stitching. And you have a gorgeous simple seam, or what looks like a simple seam, but you have no raw edges. You didn't need to buy a serger, and it's top stitched, so it looks beautiful. It'll stay. That seam will stay open. You'll be able to press it easily and find that seam, and that is a French seam with top stitch. Now to the book, we have a new page finished. Our seams, I just used one strip of tape right here, and so I can look and see this is my seam and it's got a raw edge. Here's my seam with the top stitch and that raw edge there, and then here's my French seam with the top stitch, so it's attached there, and you can lift it up and see your enclosed seam and show everyone your handiwork.